community can champion the rights and safety of Israel and Palestine, that blindly supporting the actions of the Israeli government harms both Israel, Palestine and the Jewish community in the diaspora. I think that's a pretty good starting point for a politics based on equal rights and consistent democracy, which to me are core left-wing principles that reject both anti-Semitism and other forms of chauvinism. So my book's not an attempt to argue that the left should not be vocal or active in its advocacy of equality between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, and vocal and active in its advocacy of self-determination and liberation for the Palestinians, but rather that this advocacy will be more effective and, crucially, more consistent with wider left-wing principles if it's based on rational and concrete analysis and critique, rather than on demonizations of Israel, which necessarily imply hostility not only to Israeli policy, but to the Israeli Jews as a national people, and moreover, to the vast majority of other Jews worldwide, who, for, I think, quite understandable and not easily detachable historical reasons, have some degree of affinity with Israel, however diffuse or critical that might be. And that's why the sort of banal truisms that one encounters very frequently on the left, like it's not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel or anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, have so little explanatory value. As abstract statements, they're both true. But when they're made the reflexive, automatic response to any allegation of anti-Semitism on the left, I think they have the effect of engendering a kind of collective ignorance of those criticisms of Israel, or those forms of anti-Zionism which can be or are anti-Semitic. Finally then, by way of conclusion, because I think I'm probably approaching the end of my allotted time, and I should say as a tangent, there's quite a bit more in the book. There's chapters on a few sort of tangentially related topics that I might have an opportunity to explore later in the discussion. Again, copies available at the back, and that's a vulgar point to make, but if you want to buy one, you can. I wanted to share some thoughts in my conclusion, prompted by the title of the event tonight: Why Does Anti-Semitism Persist? And I think there can be a tendency amongst those of us affected by anti-Semitism and those attempting to analyse it to view it as an almost kind of mystical force, historically transcendent and not only persistent, but essentially fixed and immutable, belonging to a single historical thread and impelled by some almost innate hatred in all non-Jewish consciousness. Now, given historical Jewish experience, it's not difficult to understand why a view like that might arise, but I think it's wrong. I think anti-Semitism is both historically contingent and something we can defeat and overcome. Different forms of anti-Jewish bigotry are just that, different. Although they share common themes and motifs, they arise in and are shaped by distinct social conditions. So it hardly makes sense, for example, to attempt to confront modern anti-Semitism, particularly in the forms I've been talking about, as if it's the same thing as anti-Jewish persecution in the Seleucid Empire, however tempting such comparisons might be at this time of year. And I believe anti-Semitism is something we can defeat and overcome because I believe in ideological transformation, in the transformation of consciousness, people's worldviews and ideas. I believe that through struggle, both over the conditions of economic and social life and on the terrain of ideas and on the kind of bridges between those two terrains, people's worldviews can change and bigoted ideas can be confronted and uprooted. I think the alternative view, seeing anti-Semitism as fixed and immutable, can't lead anywhere progressive or emancipatory, but can only impel a retreat into particularism and perhaps into the view that our best hope as Jews is to wall ourselves off behind the fences of a highly militarized state and to just kind of batten down the hatches. Again, given historical Jewish experience, it's not difficult to understand how that view arises. But I think we can and must aspire to be more than the accumulated imprints of our historic oppression. We can and must aspire to shape the future for the better. I think anti-Semitism can only be ultimately overcome as part of a wider effort to transform social conditions and the consciousness they shape, to build a world free not just from anti-Semitism, but from all forms of bigotry and oppression. And that's where I want to leave it tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for your very, very interesting talk. You touched on a number of points. I think I'll just kind of start by reflecting on, I think as someone who's as Jewish and also considers myself to be on, I suppose, the left of the spectrum, though not quite as probably far as the left as you, it's been a fairly kind of exhausting past 5 years, I think, in terms of the fact that Jews have been sort of thrust into the spotlight, really, in terms of the coverage that we've had as a group in the media, in Parliament. We've kind of been at the real forefront of discussion. It's often felt the conversation has been about us, other people talking about Jews and what is anti-Semitism, and it's been quite an odd experience, and particularly, as Tanya said, growing up in Nottingham in a very minority, you grew up as a minority, the anti-Semitism you experienced was very much based around ignorance rather than malice or rather than political ideology. And then it was quite odd seeing over time this discussion of what is anti-Semitism, people talking about it on TV, the Conservatives making accusations and sometimes wondering, is this in good faith? What about all the Islamophobia that you have in your party, etc.? Are you really doing this because you care, or are you just kind of making accusations? And I think it's been very hard a lot of the time, I think, in recent years to be Jewish. And so I'm glad that we're continuing to have these conversations in what is a safe space, and we're able to have our opinions come together. So just reflecting a little bit on your talk, I think, so you mentioned the two forms of anti-Semitism. The first one, you mentioned about kind of stereotypes around Jews being linked to finance and capitalism. And I think that's very interesting, just linking it to Bruce's talk, that so much of that was perpetuated by Christianity, in part because of Christian regulations forcing Jews into usury, forcing Jews into banking in the Middle Ages. And it's incredible how that has kind of impacted our society, and as I suppose in some ways these stereotypes about Jews continue, and we see it be perpetuated in, I think, the media as well. Certainly some of the anti-Semitic comments you might have got out of ignorance would be linked to perceptions of Jews being rich, Jews picking money off the floor, that kind of thing. And so that really continues to this day. And I think in some ways, I know you separated the two, but I think they are linked insofar as often the anti-Semitism centered around the conflation between Israel and Jews and Zionism is, as you said, linked to this idea of Jews being part of a kind of shadowy, global, controlling elite. And, people say Jews are part of the Illuminati, for instance, and that is kind of coded as running capitalism and running finance, etc. I think just as well, conscious I don't want to, I think I could keep talking about, I could do my own talk, I think. Maybe I should be the next speaker. No, I think, as someone, again, who's organised as part of Jewish left-wing groups, it's really encouraging to hear that you remain optimistic and that you remain positive about what we can do. I think it's, as I mentioned, I think it's exhausting, not just for Jews who are involved on the political left, but for Jews in general, to be having these conversations, to be having these kind of struggles, to be trying to constantly convince people when you feel like you're coming up against a brick wall. I think it's encouraging that you're remaining optimistic, you're in the thick of it. And I think we should all try and adopt that mindset, even though it's hard. And I'll ask you a few questions around that when we do questions. So yeah, thank you again. And I'm sure the audience enjoyed it as well. So I've just got a few questions, and then maybe I will go to some of the questions that are online. So if you just let me know what they are, then I will do that. So the first question I'd like to ask is, what can be done to make people realise that anti-Semitism is still racism in political movements, and particularly on the political left, in your experience?
So I think a lot of the discussion about what to do about this and how the phenomenon of left anti-Semitism can be confronted, particularly in the Labour Party, has taken place on kind of administrative and bureaucratic terrain, by which I mean it's been a discussion about what can we do to streamline complaints procedures, to expedite expulsions of people from the party? How can we make it easier to kick people out of the party? The discussion is very much focused on the kind of administrative and procedural and bureaucratic. And I think this is basically a kind of dead end, because what we're confronting here is an ideological phenomenon, and it's not something that you can kind of just cut out and kick out and cauterize in a procedural and bureaucratic way. So what I talk about in the book is the need for what I call a political educational campaign, a campaign of political education aimed at confronting the ideas, the left anti-Semitism as an ideology and form of thought, and trying to uproot it and change people's minds. And in practical terms, I think that what that consists of is discussions like tonight's. I think it consists of reading groups around what is now a slowly expanding kind of body of literature about left anti-Semitism that's kind of from and within the left specifically. I think it's going to involve probably some uncomfortable and messy debates, but all of that stuff is necessary. And unfortunately, the kind of culture of political education in general in the Labour Party has shrunk down almost to nothing. So there isn't much culture of organising consistent political education about anything, anti-Semitism or anything else. But I think there's really no shortcut around that. Something else I wanted to pick up on, and this is probably a contentious point to just sort of drop into the discussion when we don't have very much time, is the question of left anti-Semitism as a form of racism. And part of the argument I make in the book is that actually understanding kind of people on the left who recycle some of these ideas as racists, i.e. as people who kind of code Jews as a racialized other, probably obscures more than it clarifies. Because I think left anti-Semitism it's more a form of sort of irrational political hostility than it is based on the idea that Jews are a racialized other who have some characteristics based on her biological heredity that kind of impel the hostility. And of course, like the reflexive response you get from a lot of people on the left is, how can you accuse me of anti-Semitism? I've campaigned against racism all my life. And it's true, right? Like the people who say this, they really have. And I take them at their word when they say that, if their local synagogue was attacked by the far right, they'd be there defending it. I'm sure they would. And I think what we have to do is sometimes draw a distinction between kind of racialized anti-Semitism and the forms of kind of slightly more slippery kind of political ideological phenomenon that we're talking about on the left. Now, obviously, there are blurrings at the edges and there are crossovers, and it's not always possible to draw hard and fast lines. But I do think a bit of nuance is necessary. So I'll leave it there.
And you touched on, you feel there's a need for a campaign of political education. What do you think the role is of the Jewish left in being part of this and in tackling anti-Semitism on the left in general?
Well, I think it has an important role, and the Jewish left is a sort of broad and diverse spectrum within itself. I think it has an important role, although I do stress that it definitely shouldn't be seen as the primary responsibility of the Jewish left to confront this issue, because, as I said in my talk, I think anti-Semitism poses a threat to the endeavour of left-wing politics as such, whether you're Jewish or not only to the Jewish left and not only to Jews. And I think what the kind of, let's say, the non-Jewish left, the sort of predominantly non-Jewish left, needs to do is be much more alive, I think, to the kind of reality of political contestation and diversity within Jewish thought. Often I think a lot of the time, some of the far left has a sort of imagined idea of what political contestation and diversity in Jewish communal life looks like, and it isn't really engaging with the reality. And I think it does need to engage with the reality. And I think that engagement could help strengthen the critique of left anti-Semitism very much. Having said that, I'm also somewhat conflicted and a bit skeptical about the idea of political organisation on a kind of identitarian or communal basis. So the idea of a sort of distinctly Jewish left, as opposed to leftist Jews being part of a wider left that can sort of synthesize what's best about the histories of Jewish radicalism into its overall practice and perspectives, I think that's probably more where I see the engagement coming from, rather than there being a sort of necessarily sort of distinct and separate Jewish left, so to speak. I hope that answers the question.
It does. Yeah, it does. I think as someone who's part of the Jewish left, I agree that it's not kind of, you know, art. I say art in the sense of it's not people who are involved in Jews who are involved in organised Jewish left movements such as, you know, JLM or other affiliated Jewish labour groups, that kind of thing. It's not the responsibility of those Jews to have to tackle anti-Semitism on the left, but I do think it's kind of part of that broader picture.
Sure.
And is important in shifting discourse. We've got a question all the way from Nottingham, which is, I'm going to just read it out. So this is from Councillor Sajid Mohammed on Zoom. He wholeheartedly agrees with everything that you are saying. Please could you explain more your position on the left's Israel anti-Semitism? I think he means anti-Semitism kind of bound up with Israel. Your economic explanation was great! Exclamation mark.
Okay, so the very brief and succinct version is by the book. 2 whole chapters about it in there. Look, to try and sort of, I guess, reiterate it in succinct form. I think what's problematic about some of the hegemonic common sense in terms of the way the left thinks about Israel-Palestine is that it's based on a schema and a worldview, again, originating from Stalinism. We don't have a lot of time to go into the kind of specific history now. I hope people will indulge these shorthands. A kind of schema that's about splitting the world into 2 distinct and discrete blocks or camps, right? So there's the kind of imperialist camp, the camp of imperialism, which is wholly and irredeemably reactionary, and then there's the camp of anti-imperialism, which is wholly progressive. And a lot of the far left has this kind of camp, what I call in the book a campist schema about the world, right? And if Israel and Zionism and the kind of Israeli Jewish, not just the state, but the Israeli Jewish sort of national community are considered to be a sort of wholly contained subset of, you know, the camp of imperialism, then any form of opposition to them necessarily becomes sort of ordained as progressive, even if it's opposition in the name of a kind of reactionary alternative, if you like. And I think if you have that view, then that leads to an enormous kind of ahistorical erasure and flattening out of all the nuances and complex tensions in the history of Israel, in the history of state formation in Israel, and in the history of Zionism, you know, which was a kind of diffuse and contested movement, right? So, for example, the left likes to talk about Israel as a settler colonial state. And that is one thread. I think that is one thread in the history of Israel, right? A kind of process of something that it's reasonable to call settlement and colonial settlement. But there are other threads. So Isaac Deutscher, the Polish Jewish Marxist writer, talked very movingly in an article called Israel's Spiritual Climate about Israel being a life raft state for post-Holocaust Jewish refugees, and the need for the left to understand the kind of position it occupies in Jewish consciousness because of that. And the way that a lot of the far left approaches the issue just kind of completely flattens out all of those distinctions and nuances, and I think necessarily leads them into a kind of implied hostility to most Jews alive, because, you know, as I said, for understandable historical reasons, I think it is undeniably the case that most Jews feel some affinity with Israel, feel it makes up some part of their Jewish identity. And if you've got this kind of flat campist schema, I don't think you can begin to engage with that. So I think that's where some of the problem comes from. And I think the way to overcome that really is to reconnect with as I said in the talk, foundational left-wing ideas about equal rights and consistent democracy. So the objective reality of the situation in Israel-Palestine is that there are two national peoples there, and I think the endeavour of progressive politics should be about trying to achieve equality between them. That both people should have equal rights, in my view, including equal national rights, although that's a contentious formulation. So kind of rejecting that sort of campist scheme, or something I'd term in the book absolute anti-Zionism, but flattens out the nuances and historical distinctions, getting away from that and reconnecting with the politics of equal rights and consistent democracy, I think, is the way through the problem.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So we're now going to open up any questions to the audience, both in the shul and I think also online. And these can be questions either for Daniel or for Bruce. So would anybody like to ask a question or have a comment, like to share? Yes.
Can I ask Bruce what the reaction of your colleagues when you challenge them about the anti-Judaism history in Christianity?
In a rock and a hard place. It's not always been welcomed, that's for sure. There's an element of denial, and I think that's down to the fact that most of us have grown up in churches that have not contextualized our Christian Gospels, which were written at a time of schism between the two communities. But when people begin to hear the narrative in a much fuller, informed manner, I think there's been some degree of development in understanding. It becomes quite a turning point for some people. And in the 10 years that I've been district chair, it's 11 years since the Justice for Palestine Israel report in the Methodist Church, which was very hostile towards the state of Israel. There's been a growing awareness that it's much more complicated than was at first thought. Of course, there is that sort of element within the Methodist Church, as in every Christian denomination, that is very opposed to the state of Israel on the grounds that Dan has just shared. I personally believe that Israel is not a colonialist enterprise, nor is it an ark for those who survived the Holocaust. It's only a few days ago, I think it was, I remember last year, it was the 30th of November, that Israel commemorates the 800,000 Jews who were expelled from Arab lands. And I think it plays into the anti-Israel lobby to simply focus on Israel as a post-Holocaust refuge. It is a refuge for Jews from the whole region, as well as those who fled European anti-Semitism. And it also plays into those hands who think of the state of Israel as being a white, European, westernized democracy, when actually there are Arab parties now part of the coalition. It also comes as a big surprise to Methodist ministers, and I had a conversation only Tuesday morning about this with a colleague chair. It comes as a surprise to some of them that Arabs in Israel have been voting in every Israeli election since the Knesset was founded, and have actually been a part of that legislature. There have been members of the Knesset ever since. So I think there has definitely been a growth of awareness, but you know, you're undoing decades and generations of teaching and, you know, kind of narrow view. And it isn't going to go away as quickly as people want. And I think also what we must remember, what Yitzhak Rabin said, it takes two for peace and one for war. And it isn't just a case of Israel lowering its defense, lowering its security, in the hope that everybody around them is going to suddenly become friendly. I don't believe they are. You see, I, as a Christian minister, would find myself safer in Israel than any other nation in the Middle East. That's the truth of the matter. And that comes as a surprise too to many Christian ministers when I say, okay, you're going to be forced to move you and your family to the Middle East. Where are you going to live? Damascus? Tehran? Baghdad? Cairo? Where Copts are being kicked out by their hundreds of thousands? Or Jerusalem? And it also comes as a surprise to Christian ministers that Arab students in the state of Israel are outperforming Jewish students in high school.
Bruce, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to cut you off
Okay.
because in the interest of time, apologies.
Sorry, Mum. Okay.
So I just have, do we have any more? We can discuss, yeah. I just also, we've got another comment following on from Councillor Mohammed. He says, I'm going to buy the book. Thank you. Fantastic analysis and explanation. Daniel, we really need more education of this in the Labour Party. So you've got your first book bought.
So it's all about shifting units, really.
Just the gentleman over there.
Thank you. Thank you both for this field talks this evening. Really important, especially the introspection into about your own community and the honesty with which you approach the subject. Is that okay? Yes. No, thank you. My name is Councillor Dan Zaro, and I want to start by also thanking Rabbi Tanya for mentioning the terrible experience that I went through when I stood as a Labour councillor last year. I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail about the anti-Semitism that I experienced. I didn't stand as a Jew, but I was made to, my Jewishness was made out to be something really, really, it was made into a big thing. I was told to go and go in the gas chambers. Sure. I was told that I was a Jewish CMT. My baby was received a death threat. I had a death threat within my car. Sure. It's just really, really terrible things. No Jewish soul was compared to Adolf Hitler by the Conservative Party deputy there. Anyway.
Yeah, you might want to come up to the mic.
So just to kind of carry on, I don't know if you pick that up. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that particular experience, but maybe I can talk about that another time. But what I do want to say is that clearly, I was standing last year in Bournemouth as a candidate, and a lot of the anti-Semitism did come from local people. A lot of it was online, so it was unclear where it was coming from exactly. The police couldn't trace it. Some of it was being incited by local Conservative Party councillors, to their shame. But I thought, well, maybe that's an isolated incident of anti-Semitism in our area. But I was very wrong. And Rabbi Tanya, you mentioned some of the problems we've had in the area in recent months. We've had benches that have been swastikaed up in Cowley Hill in the north of Bournemouth. We've had, more recently, literally a couple of weeks ago, these leaflets from this far-right group, Patriotic Alternative, with anti-Semitic and Islamophobic messages on them going through the homes of Jewish and Muslim doors alongside those of the rest of the community. We've had kind of other outbreaks as well. So we've clearly got a problem that needs to be addressed locally, and obviously we've got a large community here, a Jewish community here in the area. So my question to the panel really is, my proposal, actually, first of all, is that I really think that the time has come for us to directly confront, in a localised way, at a community level, the anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Semitism that's occurring in Elstree and Bournemouth and across Hertsmere. But also, obviously, that can't be isolated from the national problem that we have, and not just the national problem of anti-Semitism, but the rise of fascism, racism, other kinds of homophobia even, and other kinds of bigotry. So my question really is in relation to this, because I know that there are moves amongst councillors, certainly in my group and the Labour and Cooperative Party group. I'm sure the Greens and the Liberal Dems and many Conservatives would join us in this. But really, it needs to also be a grassroots campaign that involves education that Daniel, you spoke about as well. But are there any kind of local experiences, perhaps in Nottingham or elsewhere, that we can draw upon for inspiration about how you take on racists and fascists and anti-Semites? Obviously, there are historical examples, but perhaps more recently. Or are there any kind of tips and advice that you can give us generally about that?
Okay, I think I'm being gestured towards to respond to that. Thank you, Dan, for your contribution. I think the kind of community-rooted campaign against anti-Semitism that you talk about is needed. I think it is necessary. And I think we can draw inspiration not just from the historic episodes that are rightly pointed to as inspirational, Cable Street, the 43 Group, etc., etc. It's sometimes easy to kind of invoke those in a sort of, in quite a reflexive way without necessarily kind of grappling with today's problems. So we can draw inspiration from those, but I think we can also draw inspiration from more recent instances of community-based efforts to confront the far right, to confront racism. In Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, where when the last time the BNP was quite strong in former mining communities in Derbyshire, there were some campaigns that I was sort of peripherally involved in, pretty kind of labour movement rooted, that confronted that, and I think we can draw inspiration and take lessons from those experiences. And I do want to say, while we're on this point, just to kind of scale that up into the global context, the discussion tonight has focused on kind of two forms of anti-Jewish bigotry: Christian anti-Semitism and left anti-Semitism. It's also important to acknowledge that we're living in a world where Viktor Orban is in power in Hungary. Donald Trump has just left power in the USA. There are far-right anti-Semitic, quasi-anti-Semitic political forces in or close to power in a lot of countries in the world. We've seen the rise of new forms of kind of conspiracy theorist anti-Semitism, QAnon, a kind of essentially a new blood libel movement. That's basically what that is. So these are all important parts of the context as well. And that's not to suggest that, because those forms might be nearer to state power, we have to focus on those and not talk about other forms, but it is about having a kind of holistic picture. I also wanted to say, this is slightly perhaps poor form in procedural terms, but I just did want to pick up on something that Bruce said in response to me. I think you were right, actually, Bruce, to kind of pick me up on a bit of Ashkenazi normativity, maybe, when I was talking about Israel. It was a life raft state for post-Holocaust refugees, but you're right. One of the other threads in the kind of Israeli Jewish national story is the expulsion and flight of Jews from Arab and other countries in the Middle East. And of course, it is true that a majority of the Israeli Jewish population is from non-Ashkenazi Jewish backgrounds. And that's something that the left often doesn't grapple with. But something that people who point to that as an example of Israel's kind of wonderful democratic multiculturalism sometimes fail to grapple with is that those communities experience quite significant racism and discrimination within Israeli society itself. And Mizrahi Jewish communities often are pretty socially disadvantaged, and there's kind of a live struggle there. And that is really the point I was trying to make. There's a lot of nuance in all of this. There are many, many different threads of many different historical threads, some in tension with each other. And as I said, I think the way a lot of the left looks at it blurs all of that out. And it's right for us to try and bring some of that diversity and those distinct threads back into focus. But if we're doing that, let's bring them all into focus.
Can I just add to that and the point you made, and you're saying what could be done? I feel so bad that you've had, your experiences, and it's only when you share that as somebody who's not a Jew, we learn that these are your experiences. Otherwise, I'm oblivious to it. But I just want to mention Salam Shalom Kitchen. So that's a collaboration between the liberal Jewish synagogue and the Muslim community, where we join together and, feed those in need. But that's also, a key part of that is dealing with and tackling, sort of anti-discrimination, basically, because it shows the force of good when communities work together and have a shared goal. And that really has a really strong ripple effect. And we've seen that in our community in Nottingham, just by both communities working together. And it's brought the communities and our knowledge of, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and how we're actually on the same side. So a lot of those kind of projects will really help. I have a couple of questions.
This gentleman.
Oh yes, you went, yeah. No, it's okay.
No,
You're here in the audience. It's fine.
Thank you. Thank you all of you for your talks today, and also from the comments you have from the audience. It's been a really inspiring session so far. So my name is Jonathan. I just wanted I guess not so much a question, but just more thoughts have been kind of going through my head as I've been listening to everything tonight. I think it's really important that we've touched on some of the non-European experiences of anti-Semitism. As myself, come from a Mizrahi background, with Arabic-speaking family. And I think, yes, we've talked a lot tonight about anti-Semitism, how it's existed, say, in a Christian space, in a left space. We haven't touched so much on anti-Semitism in the Middle East, not just recently in the last 100 years with the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but historically in the diaspora, since Jews have been indigenous in the Middle East, and many of us never left the Middle East. I think it's really important that we have started to become more aware of that, and I think as someone of a Middle Eastern background, we often feel that our story isn't understood, and there's not a lot of space for it. It's also, the introspection you mentioned about, I want to buy both of your books, and about the anti-Semitism that exists in the church is extremely important, and I think also recognizing the anti-Semitism that does exist in Islam, not to say that Islam is an anti-Semitic religion, of course it's not. Not to use tokenism, but actually the majority of my friends, not a minority, the majority of my friends are Muslim, are Arabs, or from the Middle East. And I've got no issues with Islam or non-Jewish people from the Middle East. But we have to recognize that there is anti-Semitism in those spaces, and it's sometimes not addressed and it's not talked about. You mentioned that something a lot of ministers don't recognize is actually the Israeli population, 20% of which are not Jewish and are Arab. I'd also say, as Daniel mentioned, that 55% of the Jewish population are also not Ashkenazi, so a lot of us are from places such as Ethiopia, India, where there's a lot of diversity. It doesn't mean to say that everything's okay. He mentions the negative experiences that a lot of the Mizrahim had when we came to Israel. Absolutely, that's true. We also have to balance that with what was our life like in Yemen. It was a lot worse, a lot worse. And so I think, exactly like you said, we have to look at the nuances. And sometimes when we see things in those schema that you were describing, we lose the nuance. And I think that's the key thing. Something which I feel quite strongly about, and I never used to. It's really strange how I guess our views change through time and experience. But almost that being Jewish, I think it's important from my perspective for that to be recognized as not just a religious identity. Many of us are not religious at all, but are still fully Jewish. And that's not just a kind of mind idea, it's also biological. I'm a doctor. We know that there's, for example, predispositions for certain diseases in different Jewish communities, which are different from the communities that are non-Jewish from the same part of the world. My working definition of what it means to be Jewish is, well, we're a multi-ethnic, ethno-linguistic group who have a belief system. And that belief system is part of our identity, but isn't essential to our identity. And I think the way that the world is moving in a good way. You know, we're becoming much more aware of racism, standing against racism, and it's such an important thing that we do recognise that and that we do stand against things like that. I was a clinical co-chair on our BAME network for one of the local trusts. So I feel very passionate about standing up against racism. And I think the fact that in UK law, being Jewish isn't seen as an ethnic identity is really problematic. And I think it's very confusing as a Jewish person. I don't know how everyone feels, but when it comes to what ethnicity you tick, what do I tick? Am I Arab? I don't think I'm Arab. Am I white? Well, I'm not white. I'm mixed. Yes, I'm mixed, but what mixed am I? So I always put I put my Jewish heritage as my ethnic identity because that is my ethnic identity, how I understood it. And it's also how my ancestors in Yemen saw themselves. Yes, they were Yemeni. Yes, they spoke Arabic. They spoke Judeo-Arabic. They wrote it in Judeo-Aramaic script. But they saw themselves as a different people. They had no animosity towards their neighbors, but they still saw themselves as a different people. And I think, how do we see the future of anti-Semitism going? I'm really very optimistic, but I'm not sure if anti-Semitism will ever go away. One of the reasons is because if you look at the population of Jews in the world, we're, to some polls, 0.2% of the world population. That means the majority of people, 98.8% of people, may never contact Jews. It's really hard to combat that form of discrimination when you don't have encounters with people of that minority group. One way that I think we can work towards maybe protecting against anti-Semitism is recognizing the almost ethnic identity of what it means to be Jewish. Those are my thoughts. I think I've been speaking for too long, but thank you so much, all of you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you. Just got one last question, and
Sorry, Jonathan, thank you so much. That was incredibly, sorry. It's okay. No, I think also what you said is absolutely right, that we should be challenging our Ashken normativity in Jewish spaces, as too often I think we center experiences of anti-Semitism through an Ashkenazi lens, and we should be continuing to challenge that. I just wanted to pick up on your point about the census comment. It's really interesting you raised that, because this was actually consulted on by the British government, I think with the Board of Deputies, and they recommended no, I believe because there was concerns based on the experiences in the Holocaust that listing Jew as an ethnic identity was potentially had unhappy ramifications. So, but I think it's really interesting you raise that point, because it was considered by the British government and ultimately not decided upon. So, but if you're interested in it, I might be something to write to the Board of Deputies about, to raise your points, because I think it's a very valid point that you raised. A lot of people obviously have a Jewish ethnic cultural identity, even if it's not one that's theist. So yeah, just wanted to thank you for that, and thank you for your really insightful points.
thank you.
Sorry, here you go.
No worries, thank you. So this is from Jane Castle, question coming on Zoom, and she says, may I ask why the Methodist Church has not endorsed the IHRA definition of perceived hatred towards Jews, or has a conference decided to set up a group looking into this situation after receiving a letter of condemnation from the chief rabbi?
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. That's two questions in regards to two different documents. The IHRA definition hasn't been endorsed by the Methodist Church. There was some debate in 2018 regarding the IHRA definition, and that was at a time when the Labour Party was very, very strongly opposed to the IHRA definition, or at least the NEC and others were opposed to it. And I think that filtered down. It hasn't been debated since, but the Methodist Church does have a definition of anti-Semitism, and it's little known, and I find it very, very helpful and all-encompassing. And when I shared this with a group of rabbis in 2018, they were quite very supportive of it. You might not be, but let me say, in the room was a Haredi rabbi, and Mazorti, Hebrew Congregation, all the way down to Reform and Liberal, and I shouldn't say that, all the way, well, across. And I did say, well, it takes a Methodist to get you lot together. So you know what I mean. It's an unfortunate phrase there I use. But I shared it with the rabbis, and it says any belief, policy, or action that discriminates against or incites hatred towards Jewish people, either by race or religion, or caricatures Jewish people and culture. This can include denying the right of Israel to exist or judging it by standards not applied to other nations. So that's the benchmark for Methodists and anti-Semitism. The comment by the chief rabbi wasn't regarding IHRA definition. The comment by the chief rabbi this year was regarding a Sabeel Kairos document called Cry for Hope, which you could look up. And the Methodist Church had debated this, and it was brought to the conference by those who are seeking a more pro-Palestinian viewpoint, and the document has been passed down for study. Let me just say that I am very strongly opposed to that particular document, as indeed there were others in the conference, and a notice of motion was brought against it. You could look it up. I concur with the chief rabbi in that it is a letter that is a document that is insightful, INCITE, FUL, not INCIGHT, Paul. And it contains some very, very dodgy analogies and appears to equate the state of Israel with Nazi Germany, in that it equates the Palestinian struggle with the resistance to Nazism in the 1930s. If you're going to use the Palestinian struggle and equate it to the resistance to the Nazi movement, to what are you resisting? And that, to me, implies that the state of Israel is likened to the Nazi regime. And then there's another part of that document that's historically inaccurate, in that it suggests that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was sort of fighting for the Jews, resisting the Nazis for the Jews. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, complex character, was actually resisting the Nazis' response to those people of Jewish descent whose parents and grandparents had converted to Christianity. I think that's very important. Bonhoeffer and Niemöller were not fighting for Jews per se, but those pastors and those Christian families whose ancestry was Jewish, because, of course, they came into the Jewish anti-Jewish laws of Nuremberg of 1935. So that's what the chief rabbi was condemning. He wasn't condemning the fact that the Methodist Church hadn't adopted the IHRA definition. I hope, was it Carol? I hope that's helpful. Jane, I hope that's helpful, Jane. Not everybody in the Methodist Church agrees with each other, surprisingly. I think that may be so in the Jewish communities as well. We're a broad church. There are those who support one view, there are others support others. I am chair of the Methodist Friends of Judaism. I'm a co-founder of it. And we have three criteria, three aims. One, to celebrate Judaism, the contribution of Judaism in history and the church. Two, to raise awareness of anti-Judaism, Judeophobia in the history of the Christian church, its practice and beliefs. And thirdly, to challenge anti-Semitism in whatever its guise. And that group has grown over these 8 years from 3 to around 60. And I count that as growth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce. Thank you. Can I pass over to you, Eugene?
Yep, you can. So we're now going to play a video, and this is a video message from the Chief Executive of the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, Danny Stone, and it's a video about why anti-Semitism persists and what we can do to confront it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. I'd like to thank Rabbi Tanya for inviting me to do so specifically. Your question that you're discussing tonight is the persistence of anti-Semitism. Why does it persist? And isn't it appropriate that we're discussing that question on the festival of Hanukkah, which itself is rooted in resistance to anti-Semitism? We know that it's been around a long time. Why does it persist? Well, anti-Semitism's, in my view, it's very compelling story for people, right? That kind of the myth, right? Jews as all powerful. Jews as being supernaturally powerful, right? Jews are not just lowly and verminous and worthless in the eyes of the anti-Semite. They are all powerful. And that world, that conspiracy narrative, that myth is powerful, right? And it plays out today. We know it. We know how powerful conspiracies can be because the number of referrals to the Prevent program that are coming from mixed, unstable, and unclear ideologies is growing. The Institute for Jewish Policy Research and the Community Security Trust did a poll, I think it was about 4,500 people, about 4 years ago now. And what they did was they put a load of questions to people about Jews and Judaism, and they put a number of anti-Semitic statements to them, as well as kind of placebo statements. British Jew is as British as any other Brit. So they put these different statements out, and what did they find? They found that the majority of the population, 75, 80%, are believed in kind of that Jews were good people, that they like Jews, right? And most people like Jews in Britain, which is reassuring. But when they started to put these anti-Semitic statements to people, what they found was that there was a range of responses. And in the most severe cases, anywhere, I suppose, from 5 to 8 anti-Semitic statements, if you considered these statements to be true, right, then you were categorized as an anti-Semite, right? If you believe 5, 6, 7, 8 anti-Semitic lines to be true, you were an anti-Semite. And that accounted for, let's say, about 2% of the population. Now, 2% of the population probably believe that the moon is made of cheese. So it's not necessarily a terrible number, albeit it's depressing in its kind of, in its detail. Up to 30% of the population believed one anti-Semitic thing to be true. Now, that doesn't make these people anti-Semites. What it means is that people will say things about Jews maybe they don't understand, maybe it's something that they're parroting, that they learn at a young age, maybe it's just part of that strong conspiratorial narrative. But up to 30% of the population hold one of these anti-Semitic ideas to be true. What does that mean? It means we're not walking around bumping into hardened anti-Semites all the time, but we are, chance of 1 in 3 chance of me meeting an anti-Semitic attitude. Now, when we map that onto a world that is lived now, you know, in the way that I'm talking to you digitally, that is lived online, that means that the anti-Semitic comment isn't made from friend to friend in passing in a pub. It's put online. It stays online. It's discoverable by people. It's accessible from my phone in my pocket. It's a much more prevalent, pervasive narrative that can spread. Now, if anti-Semitism persists because it's this strong conspiratorial narrative, that narrative now stays online, it's accessible by more people, then I think we have a real and present danger and problem, right? So it persists because of this narrative, I suggest. And the problem that as I see it now is that our digital world, our digital infrastructure is set up, and in some cases is directly encouraging that harm to be spread. But it's easy to talk about the problems. The question is then, what do you do about it? Everyone who's watching has a duty, if you want to fight anti-Semitism, to educate. I know Daniel's on the panel. You can, read his book. You can go out and share video content that the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust has put together. If you look at our website, you'll find videos about misogyny and anti-Semitism, the blood libel. We've got a rap about anti-Semitism. You can put that content into the online space. And you wouldn't believe that one person that you can touch through that. You are putting a marker down, you are putting something into that space so that it isn't the anti-Semitic narrative that persists. So that's really important, right? This thing is going to persist, is my view. I don't think anti-Semitism suddenly stops, right? We're in a place now where there are approximately 100 anti-Semitic incidents recorded every month, where there used to be 50. What we want to do, though I think it will stay, I don't think anti-Semitism is going to go, is that we want to see that number drop down. But ultimately, it's going to rely on education. And you know, I've given you just a very brief idea about what we can do in one particular way. There is much more room to, for example, you know, putting PSHE, personal, social, health and economic education on a proper statutory footing, ensuring that teachers are well qualified and trained in teaching it and teaching about anti-Semitism and indeed other forms of racism in the classroom. And it might be that we need to look again at the way in which the Holocaust is taught and you know, assess now, looking at where we are we doing enough to teach about anti-Semitism within the framework of teaching about the Holocaust, right? How is that being taught? That is something that there are expert organizations, the UCL Center for Holocaust Education, the Holocaust Educational Trust, that are doing all the time. But we will need to look at, as a whole at our education. So those are just some of my thoughts about what we need to do. Of course, as I say, all of you can be involved in addressing anti-Semitism. If you spot an anti-Semitic incident, report it to the Community Security Trust, the CSC. If you suspect there's criminal activity, of course, to the police. You can share resources. As I say, you can also write to your MPs. I've talked about the online safety bill. The Anti-Semitism Policy Trust will have briefings which will help you to write to your MP. There are other bits of legislation out there that I think there are some concerns about in respect of anti-Semitism. That's something that I believe every individual can do and must do. I think at last I'd say that we've been doing some specific work around misogyny and anti-Semitism, about intersecting identities. And there is a particular aggressive, violent anti-Semitism directed at women. And this is something we're trying to talk more about. We're trying to understand. We know that there are pathways on the far right from misogyny to anti-Semitism and from anti-Semitism to misogyny. But people are experiencing this dual abuse. Now, we think that there are things that could be done in respect to the way that our laws work and our prosecutions work, indeed, where there's criminal offences that take better account of the fact that people have these multiple intersecting identities. But of course, intersectional abuse isn't unique to the Jewish community. We know that Black women experience dual racism and dual harm, rather. We know that this is true of people who are in the LGBT community. We know that this is true of differently able people, disabled people. So we know that it's not just Jewish people that face this intersectional abuse. And therefore, the fact that we know about it and we're trying to understand it means that we must speak out about that other abuse. And I've always felt that where we've taken action on anti-Semitism, and there are benefits, so where the police disaggregated anti-Semitic incident figures from the general race hate figures, they went on to disaggregate the anti-Muslim hate figures from the general hate figures. That is the way I feel it should be. That anti-Semitism can help us understand and explore useful ways in addressing racism, which then must have application in other areas and lead to better action against hate across the board. And so hopefully, whilst I'm skeptical about anti-Semitism going away, I do think it can recede, but moreover, I think that we can try and work with others to ensure that reduction in harm isn't a unique Jewish experience, indeed, that it is across the board. We are in, I think, a kind of a battle at the moment. Populism across the world, narratives of us and them. You know, we had the Brexit debate. We've had kind of polarizing discussions. We see it in all kinds of areas of public life. It is a battle at the moment, a battle for democracy, liberal democracy, and it can be quite scary. But I find comfort in knowing that there are people that I deal with day to day who are fighting. And I think we see this through history. So to return to what I was saying at the beginning, you know, we have seen people fight anti-Semitism before, and it is so impressive and so admirable. There are so many great people seeking to explain anti-Semitism, educate against it, and fight against it. I have a great privilege of working with some of them, and you're having the great privilege of listening and talk about the other panelists tonight. You're having the great privilege of listening to some of them. This is a constant battle. It's one that we will have to keep going with. And so I think that you know, you can take hope that when it comes to anti-Semitism, there are people that are indefatigable, myself included. We won't give up. It may be that it has persisted, but it's never not faced opposition from people who are looking to face it down and fight it. And so I hope those are some useful reflections. I hope that contributes to the discussions tonight. I'm sorry not to be there and to hear anyone arguing back on anything in particular that I've said, but hopefully that makes for a rich and interesting discussion. And I'll look forward to hearing back from Rabbi Tanya about where you land. If anybody, as I say, wants to know more about our work, we're at antisemitism.org.uk. And I wish you all a good evening. Thanks very much.
Wow. It just leaves me, I'm Mike Walton, for those who don't know me, from the Liberal Synagogue Elstree, to thank everyone who needs to be thanked on behalf of the synagogue and everyone attending, whether here in person or online. These phones, why don't they move landscape to portrait when I'm trying to read for something? So first of all, I'd like to thank Rabbi Tanya for arranging this wonderful evening. I'd like to thank Mike Bowl at the back over there, quietly doing all the work to make sure we can stream tonight, and probably even making this microphone work. Obviously, my very special thanks, and our very special thanks must go to our panelists and speakers. Imogen and, sorry, I don't want to mispronounce your name, Fazana, thank you very much for chairing it so excellently, and on the spot, not on the spot, but thinking great questions when the rest of us are trying to mull over and digesting what these wonderful speakers were saying. So thank you very much for facilitating it so well. I didn't know whether I could call you, I had to call you the Reverend Bob, but I think I can now just call you, sorry, Bruce. Don't call you Bob, because that's not your name. But we had a lovely chat, didn't we?
Mike, I get called all sorts of things, most of them I don't hear.
So Bob, so Bruce, thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. And that was also another Daniel, wasn't it, from amazing contributions. Thank you so much. I, for one, will need a lot of time to digest and consider everything. It's a lot to take in for a little headline me. So I think we all need to buy the books, which I do believe Daniel did mention once or twice. So Bruce's book will be available here in the foyer, but also obviously online, Echoes of Contempt, and Daniel's book, Confronting Anti-Semitism on the Left, I'm sure is available online. As well, not everyone's here, you see. Just Google and you'll be there, won't you, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
So, thank you so much. And I think that's it then.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Oh, don't worry about them. It's not a problem.
Is the transmission over?